Hello my friends, I wanted to quickly talk about upgrading a PC versus buying a new one. This is a 7-year-old PC and I wanted to upgrade it because it was rather slow in video editing. So I put in a new video card, but then turned out that the power supply doesn't have the proper power output for the new video cards. Then it also turned out that the motherboard, since it's pretty old, uses DDR3 memory, which is rather slow, and all new memory is DDR4. Also, the processor cannot really be reasonably upgraded because the socket on the motherboard for the processor, basically the layout of the processor pins, and it only fits certain Intel processors. Not reasonable to put a newer Intel processor into this motherboard. As I figured, if a PC is 6 or more years old, a much better option would be to just buy a new PC and keep the old one, because if you try upgrading an old PC like this, you will end up replacing most of the components anyway, like replace power source, motherboard, processor. Then a new processor takes more power, so it needs a stronger ventilator, so a new fan. And then you need a new memory, because DDR3 wouldn't fit on any modern motherboard. And also, if you have hard drives that are not SSD, you might want to go for an SSD hard drive that mounts onto the motherboard. That pretty much sums up all of the components of a PC, except maybe a DVD drive, but I mean nobody really uses those anymore. And of course you can keep your old monitor and keyboard and mice. What was really surprising for me is that building a new PC from components has turned out to be very hard. I spent several days running around shops and scratching my head and having a PC that wouldn't even boot. I'm used to the fact that in the old days, if your components fit together on the motherboard, then they would just be working. However, that's no longer the case. For example, a video card like this needs a separate power supply. If you don't plug this in, then you basically don't have a video card and the computer wouldn't boot. Also, modern cases don't have a beeper. So normally a motherboard, if it doesn't see memory or a processor or a video card, then it will send a special signal, beep beep beep, which you can decode and understand why it's not booting. However, the modern cases, like this one, don't even have this beeper, so if your motherboard is not booting, then you don't even know what's the problem. The biggest problem we had was that the motherboard had insufficient firmware version for the processor. So here you can see the motherboard firmware version is written. It's 4.2. B450 motherboard, the one I have, only supports Ryzen 5 series processors from something like 4.8. To upgrade the firmware version on the motherboard, you need to insert the processor that it currently supports and then go to BIOS and upgrade using a USB stick. However, if your computer doesn't even boot, then you can't do this. I ended up going to the local computer store and having the folks upgrade the BIOS for 10 euros. Really hard to figure out what was the problem to begin with. Same goes for memory chips. Modern motherboards come with lists of memory chips that they support. If you buy memory that is DDR4 and is in supported memory range, but is not listed as supported, then you have a chance that it wouldn't work. Another problem that I had in the past was that the cooler wouldn't fit into the case. So it's very important when you're buying a new case, or maybe you have an existing one, to check the height of the cooler and the maximum supported height of the cooler for the case, and that the height of this guy is equals or ideally smaller than the corresponding value for the case, because it really sucks when you can't close the side of the case. Another small thing that made my life really hard was that on this motherboard, the memory chips, they only clip in from one side. So on the top there is a button you can push to release the memory, but there is no such thing on the bottom. So when you insert the memory, it's really important to put it next to the motherboard, see if the legs line up, Then you slide the bottom side into the fixed clip, and then you gently push the top side into this opening clip to then gently push both sides of the memory, bottom and top, in place. Because what happened to me was that I pushed the top side in place and the top clip has closed, but the memory didn't make the full contact at the bottom. So I had to also really gently push the bottom side in, and then the top side and then the bottom side, to make sure that all legs of the memory make the contact. And if you don't do that, if some legs do not acquire the contact, then it wouldn't boot and you would have no idea why. Another silly mistake that I made was to wrongly connect the power source for the motherboard. You can see there is an 8-pin connector, but it's split in two. So it goes as 4 and 4. And so because it's really dark in this corner and there's really not enough space to put your hands in, I was doing this without looking, so basically by feel, and I plugged in the connectors, but it turned out that the left connector was actually partially outside. So basically I connected the wrong pins. Then I tried to turn on the computer, and I'm really thankful that the motherboard didn't burn out and the processor is okay, because it could have turned out very bad. Also, the CPU fans like this are pretty gigantic and have a lot of parts. It took me maybe an hour or more to just assemble this guy, and I ended up putting it upside down. I realized that it's probably a much better idea to put on the fan when the motherboard is out of the case, because you need access to all those screws hidden below the CPU fan, and there's really not enough space in here to fiddle with them when the fan is already in the case. So, having spent many days and many trips to and from stores trying to get this PC working, I definitely think if I knew all this, I would just buy an already assembled PC next time, even if it would be a little more expensive, because it really reduces the risk of something not booting or damaging the components during the installation. Because if your PC is not booting, you really do not have an idea what is wrong, especially with modern motherboards and modern cases that don't have beepers to tell you if the processor or the memory or the video card is at fault. When you buy an already assembled PC, there is also a chance that it will be damaged in the shipping, because the video cards are just so heavy and they tend to bend or slightly go out of the slot. If you bought an assembled PC and it doesn't boot, then you can just send it back. However, if you build a PC yourself and it doesn't boot, at least in Russia, you can't send the components back, because first of all, you don't know which component is not working, and second, they wouldn't accept it because you could have damaged it, for example, by static electricity or something else. Another option is, instead of trying to pick every component yourself, use one of the well-known builds where the motherboard, CPU, memory, hard drive and video card are all already tested together and confirmed working. I'm really happy to have a working PC and not just a bunch of very expensive components lying around. However, if I knew all the trouble and all the nuances, I would probably buy a pre-assembled PC. Thanks for watching and see you next time.